You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. I'm your host, Will Compernal. Rising migration rates are shaping up to be an important topic, not only for this year's November elections, but also for the longer-term trajectories of the U.S. economy and federal budget. A recent report from the Congressional Budget Office suggested more undocumented migrants are in the country than previously estimated, helping grow GDP and satisfy the American labor market's seemingly insatiable demand for more workers. On today's episode, we talk with Julia Gelatt, Associate Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute, about the primary forces driving U.S. immigration trends, the economic impacts of immigration, and the role of policy versus external factors. Stay tuned. Coming up soon, our interview with Julia Gelatt, Associate Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. But first, a quick market update. The FOMC left rates unchanged this week, as expected. Chair Powell emphasized that future rate hikes are not his base case for now, but high first quarter inflation has increased the length of time the Fed will need in order to have greater confidence that inflation is on a downward path to 2%. The Fed also announced plans to slow the pace of its quantitative tightening by roughly half beginning next month, reducing the monthly redemption cap on treasuries from $60 billion to $25 billion. This morning's employment report showed job growth slowed in April from 315,000 to 175,000, and the unemployment rate ticked up a tenth to 3.9%. The data were weaker than expected, but it's premature to say the report signals an inflection point just yet. Steady job growth has combined with signs of labor market normalization in this week's JOLTS data that point to an economy in much better balance than during peak inflation. Last week, the first quarter GDP growth surprised the downside at 1.6%, but the measure of final domestic demand shows underlying strength. The March PCE data, also released last week, showed that household spending and income are still on solid footing heading into April. At the same time, the Fed's preferred measure of core inflation was rising too quickly to end the first quarter. Treasury yields oscillated throughout the Fed news and economic releases the last 2 weeks, staying within established ranges until a solid rally after the employment report. Markets have for now moved away from pricing in the possibility of future rate hikes after Powell's press conference, but are still displaying little confidence in much policy easing this year. As of this recording, Fed funds futures are pricing in 41 basis points of rate cuts this year, with the first rate cut coming at the November FOMC decision. The latest quarterly refunding estimate showed slightly larger borrowing needs than analysts were expecting earlier this week. Treasury will keep its coupon auction sizes more or less unchanged from the previous 3-month period and make up any difference in funding needs with bill issuance for the next 3 months. That's all for the market update this time. Now our interview with Julia Gelatt. Our guest today is Julia Gelatt, Associate Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. Julia, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our topic today is immigration, a subject crucial to understanding economic growth and the labor market, not only this year, but also for the longer-term trajectory of the U.S. economy. Julia, to start things out, can you walk us through what the overall migration story looks like in the U.S. right now? What percentage of residents are foreign-born, and what are their backgrounds in terms of skills, country of origin, and whether they are documented or undocumented?
The best data that we have on the immigrant population in the United States is the American Community Survey from the Census Bureau. And the latest data we have there is from 2022. I say that just to preface that our data are always lagged, and so it's a little bit hard to represent all of the many migration trends that are happening today. But as of 2022, the Census Bureau says that there were 46.2 million immigrants in the United States, making up just under 14% of the US population. This is the largest number of immigrants we've ever had, but we had a larger population share that was foreign-born back in the late 1800s. Most immigrants in the US are legally here. 45% are actually naturalized US citizens, about 28% are permanent residents, about 5% are on some kind of temporary visa, like a student visa or H-1B work visa. And unauthorized immigrants are about 23% of all US immigrants, according to our latest estimates. Immigrants come from all over the world. The largest number are from Mexico, but there are large numbers from China and India and the Philippines, Central American countries. We have a really diverse immigrant population, but heavily Latin American and Asian these days. In terms of education, immigrants are about as likely as the US born to have a college degree or advanced degree, that are also more likely than US born people to have less than a high school diploma. So we have a little bit of a bifurcated educational distribution among immigrants in the United States. More recently arrived immigrants have higher levels of educational attainment than immigrants who have been here for a longer period of time.
I think that description is so informative. Not only is the group so big, but also, of course, I mean, this topic that is so often politicized is often boiled down to the U.S.-Mexico border, which, of course, really distracts from the richness and diversity of the backgrounds for these migrants coming in. And before I move on to my next question, I'm just kind of curious, that authorized versus unauthorized. Within the authorized migrant category, what are the sort of visas that we should keep in mind? So I can think of there are maybe seasonal ones for agricultural workers. There are student visas, of course. Then there are spouses of people who are working here. What are kind of the main categories of people, outside, of course, the ones that have been naturalized citizens, that people should keep in mind to really help describe that part of the migrant population?
When thinking about immigrants who are here in the United States, most of them are in a permanent status. So they have a green card for lawful permanent residence, or they've already gotten US citizenship. Of course, every year, a whole lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, come in on temporary visas. But because those people tend not to stay permanently, they make up a smaller share of the stock of immigrants in the United States. In terms of temporary visas, some of the big ones are what you mentioned, student visas for people to study in our colleges and universities and community colleges. The H-1B visa, that's for workers filling jobs that require at least a college degree. That's used very heavily by the tech industry. The H-2 visas, there's the H-2A visa, which is for agricultural workers who are coming for a temporary or seasonal job. And then the H-2B visa is for non-agricultural temporary or seasonal jobs. That's a bit of a smaller visa because it has a numerical cap. It's used by resorts and landscaping companies, seafood processing, kind of a wide range of seasonal industries. There's a whole alphabet from A to, I think it's V at this point, of temporary visas. So there are lots and lots of different categories, but those are some of the bigger, more often used visas.
I think the topic of immigration increased in prominence recently to people who focus on macroeconomics, like listeners of this podcast, for example, because of research by the Congressional Budget Office that suggested the number of undocumented migrants in the U.S. had been undercounted the last few years, which of course gives a pretty convincing explanation right now for our strong economic growth recently, despite higher interest rates. Now, how reliable would you say are those estimates of undocumented workers that essentially by definition are people living and working somewhat under the radar? How should we consider the CBO's estimates versus those from the census or other organizations? And I know you touched on this a bit with the idea that data lags, but of course the sources themselves can also differ a bit.
I think there are two different things to talk about here. One is estimates of the flows of people coming without prior authorization, coming illegally across the border, and then the number of unauthorized immigrants living in the United States. In terms of flows, we have some good data because at this point, most migrants who come across the border are presenting themselves to US officials. They're asking to be processed, and in many cases are asking for humanitarian protection for asylum. So the government knows, for the most part, how many people are coming in. And the government also knows how many of those people were quickly removed through deportations or other means, and how many are still in the United States proceeding through their immigration court cases. Not perfectly, but pretty well. The part that's tricky is that some people sneak across the border without being detected at all. Other people are detected, but they're known as gotaways. They're people that maybe left footprints in the desert, but weren't captured by US authorities. So that part is harder to estimate. In terms of the stock of unauthorized immigrants, we have pretty good data with some error bounds around it. We have good, high quality data from the Census Bureau on how many people live in the United States, how many housing structures there are, and how many people are in them. We also have good administrative data on all of the people who have come into the United States with some kind of visa. And we have increasingly good data about how many of the temporary visa holders have exited the United States. But then there's a little bit of uncertainty around undercount rates in our surveys, like Census Bureau surveys, and also emigration rates of legal immigrants. But there's evidence to corroborate our recent estimates of about 10 to 12 million unauthorized immigrants in the US. That corroborating evidence includes birth and death records and school enrollment records. If there were many, many more unauthorized immigrants than we thought, that would show up in death records and birth records and all kinds of records. There just aren't millions and millions more people in the United States than demographers estimate. That would become apparent. But, within the 10 to 12 million in recent years, maybe that's increased. Talking about 2024, there's a little bit of error, but we kind of have a sense of the range.
That makes sense, because to the extent that undocumented migrants might be under the radar, they still pop up. If the children are enrolled in public school, if they, are kind of coming into different databases, it's very difficult to be totally off the grid these days. For a number of reasons, and maybe one of them is that this issue is so often framed in political terms, I find that people's understanding of it can be based on the view that a change in policy is the primary explanation for changes in migration patterns. So when it comes to migration flows during the last 4 years, let's say essentially the pandemic, what is your sense of how migration flows have changed during that time, and whether those changes have been driven primarily by policy changes or external structural factors?
We have seen since the pandemic big rebounds and big increases in migration, both legal and irregular. 2020 was a very low year for people to come to the United States on visas because global mobility was really deterred by the pandemic and government restrictions. And the US government's processing was heavily impacted by the pandemic, by social distancing policies, et cetera. So it was very hard to get a visa to the United States and to come to the United States. Since then, although hampered by some backlogs, legal immigration has rebounded and even increased from the levels that we saw before the pandemic. In terms of unauthorized immigration, we saw high levels of border crossings in 2019 and then very low numbers in 2020, and then rebounds since then with very high numbers in recent years, over 2 million migrants approaching the border each year. I think that, in terms of what drives migration, it's a complex set of factors. Probably one of the biggest ones is the US economy. We have a big, dynamic economy that offers wages that aren't available in many, many other countries, particularly in countries neighboring the United States. Right now, our economy is booming. There's strong labor demand that draws people to the United States no matter what else is happening. Another factor is push factors in sending countries. There are immense push factors in the Americas and around the world. Haiti's overridden by gang violence. Venezuela has a repressive government and a failed economy. Nicaragua and Cuba have repressive governments. Central America and parts of Mexico have really severe gang violence. There are a lot of reasons why people are leaving their home countries. And then they look to the United States because of the safety and the economic opportunity that we offer here. There is a role for policy, but I think, if we're talking about irregular migration, it might be more the perception of policy than the policies themselves. I do think migrants perceived that it was better to come to the United States under the Biden administration than under the Trump administration, even though most policies are the same between the two administrations. The Trump administration tried a lot of things, was blocked by the courts for many of them. But even with the toughest policies in the world, or even with the toughest perception in the world, I do think people would still try to come to the United States if things are not good at home and if they see opportunity and safety in the United States.
I think that's such an important context, because when we think about the increase in migration flows that's happened over the last couple of years, so much of it you could think of as catch-up. After in 2020, there's very little incentive to come into the US when the economy is shut down and there's not really any job opportunities, but also that the kind of relative attractiveness of the US, being in the US compared to the countries you've mentioned, has really increased. Another thing that I actually learned about, I believe from a Migration Policy Institute podcast, is this part of the Pan-American Highway called the Darien Gap. And can you talk a little bit about how that factors into how the flow of migrants can kind of increase compared to 10, 15 years ago?
So the Darien Gap is a part of Panama where there is no highway, there's jungle. It is a really physically difficult place to move through. People are hiking through mud. It's also a place where there are gangs that victimize migrants who are traveling through. That, for a long time, was a part of the deterrence of people moving northward. Some South American countries have more generous visa policies, so theoretically migrants from around the world could get visas to South America and then try to make their way all the way through the Americas to the United States through Mexico. But this Darien Gap crossing was really difficult. With increasing numbers of Venezuelans leaving South America, many left their home country for good reasons, but were staying in Colombia and Chile and Argentina and other countries. But as they saw that there wasn't the economic opportunity there that they wanted, as they were struggling financially, many Venezuelans decided to move north through the Darien Gap. And as more Venezuelans started to move, more of an industry sprung up around that movement to facilitate people's migration. Smugglers, boats for parts of the journey, kind of support systems that help migrants through. And that crossing became more and more well known. And then migrants from Haiti, who had also been living in South America, started taking that route. And then people from all around the world now are really flying to South America and coming up through the Darien Gap and then making their way north. We know that, for example, some higher income Chinese people are making that trip. In many cases, they're able to pay for boats to go around the most difficult and dangerous parts of the jungle. That part of the world has seen very high levels of movement that hadn't been seen before. And that's just one part of the very long journey that people are taking to get to the US-Mexico border and into the United States.
I think that's such an interesting part of the story because I have to profess my prior ignorance. I had never heard of this Darien Gap, but I think it's a really important part of the story because it increases the movements to the US-Mexico border, and it's something that more or less is out of the control of US policymakers. And so I think it's a really important aspect of the story. I want to move on to what is probably one of the more contentious parts of the impacts of migration, which is the economic impacts of migrants. So when it comes to the impact of migrants on overall economic growth in the US and the impacts on native-born US workers, what does the research literature tend to say?
So immigration brings more people, and with that brings more economic growth. What's a little bit more complicated is who are the winners and the losers in that economic growth. For the most part, on average, most Americans benefit from having more immigration. That's particularly true for people who are in roles that complement immigrant workers. So if you're a high-wage tech worker, you buy a lot of services for cleaning your house and going out to restaurants and traveling and going to hotels. Immigrant workers who are earning lower wages are lowering the costs of those goods and services for you. You're an economic winner in this situation. For Americans who are more in competition with immigrants, which actually tend to be, in many cases, earlier waves of immigrants, there are sometimes, especially in the short term, negative wage impacts. There are also studies showing negative wage impacts in very niche occupations. For example, when a lot of mathematicians fled the Soviet Union and came to American universities, mathematicians born in the United States suffered more competition and had some wage impacts. But over time, immigrants and US workers tend to find ways to complement each other. For example, in the construction industry, as more immigrant workers come in, the native-born workers tend to rely on their English fluency and communication skills and move into customer-facing or managerial roles rather than kind of the entry-level jobs that the immigrants are now filling.
I think that's all really helpful to understand. The first part that is really insightful is the concept that these new workers can be complements rather than substitutes. And so the most obvious way for our brain to process the idea that you have a new population just introduced into the US is to think that it's a zero-sum game, that if this new group is getting new jobs, well, it must be taking jobs away from other people. But that is not always the case. And I think the part in history that I find to be the most illustrating of this concept is when what's often called the Mariel boat lift, when a large group of Cubans came from the port of Mariel in the early 80s and essentially showed up in Miami. And so it was this dream of social scientists where they could now look at this natural experiment. And it looked like, as you said, certain groups, maybe in the short term, were negatively impacted. But overall, there was complementarity instead of substitution. And my kind of last point to what you said is, unfortunately, we don't get a big lobbying effort from mathematicians defending their jobs. And so it is interesting, after the Soviet Union fell, I guess I haven't heard any mathematicians really sticking up for protection of their industry. But on a more serious note, within the US, where are we seeing the biggest migration flows, and what do you think explains why some destinations are more popular than others? We have a huge diversified country with lots of different industries. Where have the flows been kind of the most popular?
We're seeing new immigration flows go to the places that older immigration flows have also gone. Lots of migrants are heading to California, to Texas, to Florida, to New York, to Illinois. But what's different recently is that we're especially seeing concentrations of migrants coming across the border and heading to certain cities, sometimes moving there because Texas and at one point Arizona are funding buses for border migrants to go to Democratic-led cities in the more northern parts of the United States. So we've seen, New York City in particular, but also Denver and Chicago and other cities at times being quite noisy about the fact that they're receiving a whole lot of immigrants who are showing up needing help with very basic needs, with housing and food and healthcare and just kind of getting by, basically. These services are costing the cities a lot of money. I think that we're seeing this not only because of the buses, but again, because most migrants these days are presenting themselves to border authorities and they're in removal proceedings at immigration court. They're not hiding in the shadows like past waves of unauthorized immigrants may have been. In the past, people tended to sneak across the border. They relied on family and friends and whatever social connections they had in the United States to meet their basic needs. And they're kind of hiding in the shadows, trying not to interact with the government. These days, people are, above board. They've been processed. They're asking for protection. And they're asking local governments to help them meet their needs. They're seeing that governments provided for other migrants. So this is creating large costs for certain cities in the United States.
Early on in the pandemic, we saw some places like Boise, Idaho, or Butte, Bozeman, Montana, really struggle with having their infrastructure adjust to population booms from people moving primarily from the Bay Area, tech workers that could work remotely. And in those cases, it was rapid domestic migration, but I imagine these pressures happen no matter where the people are coming from. So how are different localities coping with the public finance aspect of higher spending needs on things like infrastructure and schools? I mean, I can see where I live in New York City, as you describe it, these buses arrive. There is kind of propensity to try to provide for them and support them, but it has come at such a rapid pace that it can be difficult to provide those resources in a kind of effective manner because of how rapid the pace is.
I wish I had some great success stories to share with you or even promising emerging practices. I'm sure there are some out there. I've mostly personally heard about the challenges. We have what some people call a housing crisis in this country. Even before more migrants showed up, housing is really one of the very biggest challenges. It's difficult to afford housing when you first enter the United States and you may or may not have work authorization and you may or may not know how to find a job that pays wages that can support your living situation. So I think that is a really big challenge. There is some federal funding for schools and for the basic services that cities are providing, but it's really not sufficient to meet the costs. There have long been conversations in this country about the fact that immigration policy is federal policy, but it's the states and localities that bear the initial costs of immigrants arriving. They also benefit from those immigrants' economic contributions, but there tend to be some upfront costs that can be a challenge. And so there's a strong argument, I think, for more federal support to states and localities meeting migrants' initial needs.
The housing aspect of it is really interesting, I think, because as we talked about, new workers don't need to be necessarily always substituting for native-born workers. It's not a zero-sum game, but we have such an inflexible housing supply that sometimes the introduction of new people does mean that it is trying to fit more people into the same amount of space. And so, I think that is a really important part of the story. It's interesting, when you talk about the federal budget compared to the stresses on local or state governments. What does the research tend to say about the impact of migration trends on the federal budget? I think the Congressional Budget Office and other research tried to get at this recently, but what is really a big takeaway?
So the research shows that immigrants tend to be net fiscal contributors at the federal level. Many immigrants aren't eligible for public benefits. Immigrants are working at high rates and paying taxes, and so tend to contribute more than they take on average. Of course, higher educated immigrants, just like higher educated US born people, contribute more. Less educated folks contribute less. At the state and local level, immigrants tend to be a net fiscal drain, and that's because of the education costs for their children, which get attributed to the immigrants, even though those children are US born. So that is part of the argument for why there could be some redistribution from the federal government to the local government. I know that the CBO recently did some estimates of, what they think immigration levels were recently and what they're projecting into the future. They assume pretty high immigration through 2026 and then lower levels. And they say that, under these assumptions, immigrants will add 7 trillion to gross domestic product over the next decade and about 1 trillion to federal tax revenues. So more people in the United States grows our economy and also grows our tax revenues at a time when the country is preparing and supporting a larger retiree population that will have a big drain on public coffers.
You mentioned earlier all the different kinds of visas, and then also maybe some of the different scenarios about processing migrants at the border or just overseas for kind of skilled workers. So I know this next question probably warrants hundreds of podcast episodes, but what would you say are the most impactful policy reforms out there that would allow the U.S. immigration system to function better? What do you see as kind of the low-hanging fruit of changes to legislation?
I really wish there was low-hanging fruit. Immigration is so hard for Congress, but someday when Congress finds the will, we really just need to update our visa policies. We're working with immigration laws from 1990, but really on an infrastructure from 1952. The number of annual visas hasn't changed, even though our population has grown, the world population has grown, and we have an aging population, and the distribution across different categories hasn't changed. The country would benefit from a lot more employment-based immigration. We have a lot of employers who would really benefit from having more immigrant workers. They could grow their companies. They could be more productive if they had more immigrant workers. But the pathways right now are so narrow. There are only 140,000 employment-based green cards each year, and actually half of those are taken up by the spouses and children of the sponsored workers. It's a very, very low level compared to our overall immigration system, compared to other countries, compared to the needs. And then I think there's a lot that could be done just to kind of streamline and facilitate migration. We're lucky in the United States that people really want to come here and they're willing to put up with years-long delays on their cases, but we shouldn't really be putting people through such challenges. Countries around the world are trying to compete with us for high-skilled immigrant workers in particular, but immigrant workers generally. We're not working very hard to be competitive. Our policies are outdated and our processes are really complicated. We also do need to address the border. There are policy changes that could lead to better processing and faster processing of migrants and faster decisions on people's asylum claims. Right now, people are waiting years and years to get those answers, and that is, I think, creating the wrong incentives at the border. But revisiting our visa policies could have a really big economic impact. So I think that in terms of economics, that is a good place to start.
I want to end with a pretty open-ended question. I'm sure, as someone who is working day to day in migration policy, you have a wide number of answers for this question. What do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about migration in the public sphere? Where do you think the kind of most value added could be compared to what the public conversation tends to be about?
One thing is that people, I think, tend to think that most immigrants who are here without legal status, and that most immigrants are low skilled immigrants. When the truth is that, we have very high levels of legal immigration. We have many, many very high skilled people coming in who are contributing in all kinds of ways to the country, from filling important jobs to creating companies and creating more jobs. So I think that the kind of stereotype of who is an immigrant is pretty wrong compared to the reality of who are the immigrants in the United States. Another thing is something that I think we've talked about is just that I think there's a perception that there's a fixed pie of jobs and that immigrants are directly competing with the US born for jobs, even though immigrants create jobs either by starting businesses or just through their consumption like the rest of us. We all pay for goods and services, and that creates more demand for more workers. So, more immigrants doesn't mean that there are fewer jobs to go around or fewer resources to go around. We can actually grow our overall economy, grow the number of jobs, grow the availability of goods and services, and have more than we would have without immigrants.
Julia Gelatt, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Julia Gelatt, Associate Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. A couple things stand out to me from that interview with Julia. The first is the overall economic impacts from immigration. Local budgets can certainly struggle to cope with the pressures of abrupt population inflows, especially when it comes to school funding. But otherwise, migrants boost growth and are net contributors to the federal budget. Another thing is how external factors play such an important part in determining migration flows into the U.S. Weaker foreign economies and logistical improvements in things like the Darien Gap are making it relatively more appealing to make the journey towards the U.S.-Mexico border, pulling people to the U.S. independent of domestic immigration policy. The data calendar next week is relatively light, with the highlight being the preliminary University of Michigan sentiment survey on May 10th. Otherwise, the following week will have much bigger macroeconomic implications, particularly with the April CPI on May 15th. Inflation is back to being even more in the driver's seat of bond market pricing, especially with strong growth and no sign that labor market weakness will cause the Fed to consider cutting rates anytime soon. Also that week, the April retail sales will give the first important second quarter data on consumer spending. Fed officials are now free to speak publicly after this week's FOMC decision, so that will take most of the market focus next week during a relatively light data week. Since there's little ambiguity about the Fed's messaging after this week's meeting, we don't expect any groundbreaking comments from FOMC participants until after important data updates. Chair Powell has one scheduled appearance on the calendar in a couple weeks, which will come after the April CPI is released. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening. I'm Will Compernell, macro strategist with FHN Financial. This episode was edited by Bill Stanfield. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Simply Put wherever you get your podcasts. Email simplyput@fhnfinancial.com with any questions or comments. This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.